Well, good morning, everyone, or whatever time you're watching this. This is Module 2, Week 2 of our video game course. And this week, we're in theory going to be going to an arcade. And the reason we're going to go to an arcade is we're going to experience the most basic, boiled down level at which a video game can manage to be appealing and make you want to keep playing even if it's a very simplistic game, like an old school arcade game, like you used to play in arcades back in the day. But really, the theme of this week is to try and figure out, why do people play video games? So an intuitive answer to this question is just to say because they're fun. I mean, why does anyone watch movies, read books, watch TV shows? It's fun. Uh, so let's look at this fun, an amusement or enjoyment. That's a good enough reason to do anything. But this doesn't really hold up if you think about it for even a second, because a lot of games, and for that matter, a lot of movies, a lot of TV shows are not fun. Watching horror movies, for instance, is not really fun. There's something about horror movies. They're exhilarating, maybe. Maybe there's adrenaline. It's kind of funny to call it fun, though. Similarly, with horror games, they might be fun in a sense, but the main appeal doesn't seem quite, it doesn't seem accurate to characterize it as fun. And many games are actually really frustrating. Look at Dark Souls. I don't know if you've played Dark Souls, but I have. And Dark Souls is an infamously frustrating game to play. There's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of dying. You will die a lot as you try to learn how to play Dark Souls. There's a I got the picture of the speed running guy here, the speed running meme. Speed running is not really fun. No one seems to be having fun during the speed run itself. And then there are games like QWOP. I don't know if you've played QWOP before. It was really all the rage for a second. QWOP is this game where you control an Olympic runner, but you can only control their left and right thighs and their left and right calves. And you try to run as much as you can, and you just can't really control them. And I guess that's the appeal of the game, is that it's so difficult and so frustrating to do something so simple that is actually kind of amusing how hard the game is. So yeah, fun doesn't quite seem to get everything. There seems to be more to the story. So you talk about bragging rights. Back in the day, uh, like the arcades we're going to go to, arcade cabinets had these high scores, like leaderboards. If you managed to get the highest score out of anyone on that machine, then you put your initials in, and so people can see when they come to play the game, or if they're just glancing at the game, they can see someone named DFT has the high score here. And in the early days, before we had online gaming and everything, that was kind of where community was built, was people kind of edging each other out. It may not have actually been that fun, the process of putting quarter after quarter into the machine and trying to finally get onto the high score board or get to a certain position. But actually getting there, that is where the fun comes in, is sort of the sense of accomplishment after the fact. I can see a lot of people saying, well, I play games because it's fun to sort of learn to play the game and master the game, right? So that's kind of a Dark Souls type of thing. I've never met anyone who started playing Dark Souls and felt like, oh, I understand how this game works. I get it. No, you have to kind of learn how to play it. And it's kind of rewarding in a way to finally pass that threshold and feel like, I figured out Dark Souls. And, there are other things like the kill death ratio. I'm not a first person shooter person, and I'm not much of an online gamer, but apparently this is a thing where the ratio of people you kill online to the times you have died is sort of a high score or bragging right, or it's a metric of how good you are at playing a game. Um, just like with competitive sports, there's a sense in which afterwards, after you've made an accomplishment, that's fun and that's rewarding. But being an athlete or doing what it takes to get a good kill death ratio itself might be like work, like not something that's actually fun. And then there are other motivations for playing games. Of course, we know about fantasy and escapism and discovering new experiences. That's why virtual reality or VR might be really taking off because that's even more immersive than typical games are. One thing that I'll probably put on the quiz is this idea of spatial presence. If you do a deep dive into the game design literature, you'll hear a lot of talk of spatial presence. And it's this idea that at some point you're playing a game and you feel like you're playing a game. You're learning what buttons to press, you're learning like how to navigate what are the rules of this world. In some games you can't jump or swim, some games you can. You kind of figure out this sort of awkward phase at first, but eventually for many games you want people to forget about the actual mechanics of making your avatar move in the game. You want people to just feel like they're in the game. They have spatial presence. So one thing that a lot of games will do is they'll get rid of what's called a heads up display. A lot of older games would have your health, how many lives you have, how much ammunition you have for your gun. Newer games are saying, that kind of eliminates the spatial presence. We want people to feel present in their environment. So we try and find ways to minimize the heads up display or HUD. People also play games because they want to be creative, like way back in the day, Mario Paint came out. It's a game where you can uh, paint and compose music. And this sort of going back to some of the themes of the first module, this sort of blurs the line between what's a game and what's an app. Because Mario Paint is a game, but it's kind of not. It's kind of like just turning your Super Nintendo into a computer and you're playing, not playing, you're just using like a painting program or a music composing program. It doesn't really seem like a game. So that can be a little blurry. It can blur the lines a little bit. And then I put retro gaming and throwback games here as a motivation. This is an interesting topic. It's kind of shoehorned in here, but I think it speaks to the fact that, well, first of all, it's become a big trend. Gaming has started to use people's sense of nostalgia to make them buy more content and consume more games. There's a lot of games that use old-fashioned sprite animations and artwork, which is reminiscent of much older games. So some gamers are going to remember their childhoods, fond memories of days where you didn't have work and kids and responsibilities, and you would just sit down and play games and have not a worry in the world. People pick up on that, and that's part of it. Even though you might be having fun when you play an old school retro style game, there's still a sense in which that's not the whole story. You might also be playing the game because it's taking you back and it's bringing back fond memories. So it's kind of an emotional experience. I know fun is kind of an emotion, but we're getting a little more complex than just saying fun with this. So if you want to talk about human motivation, one of the most relevant theories, a very big theory in psychology, is self-determination theory. Came out in 2000, two researchers, Ryan and Deci. This is the idea that, aside from, obviously we need to eat and drink, we need to be able to go number one, go number two. We have our basic physiological needs, but talking about actual psychological needs, Ryan and Deci said there's these three factors that really push us to do what we do in life. We have a drive for competence, relatedness, and autonomy. It's the trifecta. So how does this apply to games and what do these mean? So competence is like, just a basic definition is your feeling of being capable, self-efficacy. Ever heard of that? We like feeling competent. We don't like feeling like we're useless, that we can't help ourselves. We like to feel like we have what it takes to do what we need to do in the world. So how does gaming scratch that itch? Well, a lot of games have a sense of progression. Pokemon evolve, and World of Warcraft, you level up. We like to feel a sense of growth, like we're expanding our skill set. So while it might not be fun to learn how to play Dark Souls and not die as much, there is a sense in which your skill set and your competence has increased. According to self-determination theory, that's one of our basic psychological motives. There's also, relatedly, there's this idea of flow. If you haven't heard of flow, it's this very popular, almost kind of fad-like topic in psychology. I'm personally no expert in flow, but the idea here is that certain tasks require a level of your own skill. There's a level of difficulty and a level of skill that need to meet somewhere in the middle. If a task is too easy, it's boring. If a task is too hard, it freaks you out, creates anxiety. Now, I know when I play guitar, there are certain songs that I really love to play. Playing the simple songs can be fun, like playing a Nirvana song. The Nirvana and Green Day is very easy, simple to play. But sometimes it's really fun to play something that's a little more challenging. But at a certain point, if you're playing something that's too challenging, it's kind of you're not having fun playing guitar. You're kind of being stressed out. So flow is this sense of it's this experience of being completely immersed because you've found a task that's fun in the sense that it's meeting you right at where you need to be to really experience this flow state. And people can lose themselves. This is why flow is so popular of a concept, is because people will do something for hours and hours and hours if the task you've given them really gets at that desirable point in their level of skill and their level of engagement, where it's that sweet spot. It's not boring them, but it's also not uh, exerting them. They're in a state of flow. You hear people talk about a flow state. For me, flow, I've experienced flow, I think. See, I'm not as big into flow as some people are. I have stayed up all night playing a video game before and realized, oh my God, it's morning. I can't believe I stayed up all night. But I was like 12 when that happened. So maybe it's been a while. For me, multitasking is kind of that sweet spot where there's a little bit of my mind that's occupied on listening to an audiobook or a podcast, and there's a little bit of my mind that's occupied with playing a game like football. That's kind of my go-to these days, is playing NCAA 14, the last college football game ever made before a bunch of legal problems popped in. It's a very simple, easy game, but it requires just enough of your attention to where you can't completely disengage. Like, it's not like those role-playing games where you just hit X over and over again and just kill low-level monsters. You have to kind of pay attention to what you're doing with the football game. So I'd be interested in the forum to hear people's thoughts on flow and on gaming and whatnot. A very, very similar topic to flow is desirable difficulty. It's actually kind of tough to disentangle and distinguish these. But with desirable difficulty, this comes more from people who do research in education. And the idea is that you learn more and perform at your best when the material that you're being taught is not too boring that you're being kind of understimulated and under challenged, but not so difficult that it's kind of like you're not getting it. So I teach statistics, and I'm definitely familiar with desirable difficulty. It's very difficult to make students feel like they're being challenged but not challenged too much. It's very rare to achieve that perfect desirable difficulty where you really maximize someone's learning. But this is a huge topic in learning circles, is trying to figure out with your student population that sweet spot of desirable difficulty, because it's amazing what you can achieve when you find out just the right amount of challenge for your students or your trainees or whatever you're doing. So enough about competence. Let's talk about autonomy. Autonomy basically means freedom. Whenever you take on a lot of responsibilities in life, you have a demanding career, if you have kids, um, just lots of random stuff you need to do and you have no free time, your sense of autonomy goes down. You feel like you have no say in what you're doing. And this can be a very serious source of depression in people's lives, is this feeling of being trapped, like you never have time to just sit down and just, do whatever you want and do nothing if you feel like it. You feel like there's always something you need to do. And yeah, so games can help relieve that stress if you're feeling a loss of autonomy in life. And really, if you just like that feeling of absolute freedom. So in Grand Theft Auto, I personally, I feel bad saying this, but I have fun beating up random people and stealing their cars and going and running people over. I kind of feel bad after a while, like, why am I enjoying this? But it's kind of fun just breaking the rules and driving on the sidewalk and driving your car into the ocean. No, I mean, sure, the cops come after you, but you can run them over too. It's kind of like liberating to just feel like, I can do whatever I want. No one, I don't have any appointments to be at in Grand Theft Auto. I don't have to drive on the right side of the road. And that might be kind of what sandbox games are good for too, is this sense of just limitless, no boundaries. You just do whatever you feel like. Autonomy is a very important part of people's lives. You can really demoralize someone if you make them feel like they don't have choices. People like having choices. People don't like when you take choices away. And then finally, relatedness is pretty straightforward. It's a sense of social affiliation, belonging to a group or a team. Certainly, multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft can really, like, even if you're not into gaming, so many people will just go all in on a certain MMO game because they make friends. And for some people, friendships just work better on a massive online multiplayer game because, real life friendships come with certain obstacles, whereas online friendships can be a little more relaxed in certain respects. A lot of people have met online through these games and gotten married. I know a couple who are married and live together and have a kid and everything. And they met on World of Warcraft. And people form guilds and teams. And if that's a part of your life, I mean, I'm not saying gaming is like a poor man's version of a social life. That's not what I'm saying at all. It can be like if you have issues socializing, gaming can be a good way to make up for that. But even if you don't have social issues, like just kind of socializing with people, gaming can just augment your sense of relatedness and satisfy that need that we have to feel like connected to people. Speaking of connection, one of the major theories of psychological motivation is, let me put myself right on this guy's head, social comparison theory. So you might have heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. The Joneses down the street just got one of those new 3D TVs so they can watch shows in 3D. You put on 3D glasses, and they just got the new car. And there's a sense in which a lot of people do what they do in life because they want to compare themselves to others in a positive way. It really feels good to make some major achievement in life. And psychologists have studied this. And, part of the reason we like to achieve things is because it feels good to have something that others don't. It feels good, like, I got this trophy and you didn't, or I just got a promotion. What have you been doing? That's this very motivating thing for a lot of people, is this feeling of superiority. And we trash talk whenever we get like a higher score and stuff, but also works in the other direction. So social comparison theory says that it's very motivating when we compare ourselves to other people and we don't like how we measure up. So if your friends have all been like successful and doing all these cool things in life and going on awesome trips, and you're kind of stuck at home and your career is stagnating, that's potentially very motivating. It'll make you want to go out and, get a degree and get a fancy job and throw it in people's faces and stuff. Social comparison theory doesn't paint us in a very positive light, but there is a lot of truth to it. It's not the whole story of human motivation, but it's a undeniable, empirically based part of why we do the things that we do. And in gaming, some designers keep this in mind. I know in Forza, that's a racing game, and Candy Crush, they have features in the game that will have you compare yourself to how your friends are doing in the game. So that kind of incorporates social comparison theory into the design of the games to try and make them more engaging. So, having gone over all these different theories of why people play games and trying to get the full picture, we're still left with some kind of puzzling behaviors. Games are frustrating. Uh, and, we can explain, like, well, maybe people put up with the frustration because there's an achievement to it. And maybe you want to be like, oh, yeah, I'm hardcore. I play Dark Souls. I'm going to socially compare myself favorably to you because I'm a hardcore gamer that beat Dark Souls and you're not. So we've gone a ways into uh, explaining why some people would do something that's not really that fun. But it's still kind of puzzling. We do these things that really just are not, they're so obviously and so patently unfun. Like side quests in games sometimes are fun, but a lot of times they're just not. Like you go and kill 80 rabbits and you'll get this tiny trinket that really doesn't affect the game. Trophy hunting, that's one I really, really don't personally get at all. I wish I could remove trophies from all game platforms. I wish that was an option because it just bugs me when I beat a part of a game and it's like, you got a trophy for beating the intro to the game. I'm like, get out of here. I don't care about your stupid trophies. But I know people who will spend hours on end, and I mean just 20 hours a week doing these really tedious tasks to get these trophies. And these trophies are just like points on an abstract server somewhere that don't matter. It just means that you're a masochist, as far as I'm concerned. And then there's grinding. In some games, if you do a monotonous task over and over again, you will very slowly level up or get new things. Role playing games are pretty bad about this, where um, you don't have to grind, like kill monsters over and over again, weak monsters that are easy to kill. Just hit X or A, whatever the main button is, over and over and over again. Just kill and kill and kill and kill over and over again. And then you'll finally level up and you're like, awesome. But I'm not really that excited because I need to kill even more monsters so I can level up again. But so people might put up with grinding as a means to an end, but there are people who will max out the stats. Like they'll play a role playing game like Final Fantasy X. I know a guy who said he maxed out the sphere grid on Final Fantasy X and got every character, learned every ability, and got every stat boost. Having played Final Fantasy X, I understand how outrageously time consuming that must have been. And I asked the guy, why? Why are you playing this like 20-year-old game and maxing out all these stats? Why not turn the game off and go play a different game? And he just said, I don't know. He had no explanation. A lot of puzzling behaviors. So, one way to make sense of this is the psychology of motivation. There's this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when something's just motivating in and of itself. Um, it's actually the best form of motivation, and sometimes you can demotivate people by distracting them from what's intrinsically enjoyable about a task. And this is contrasted with extrinsic motivation. This is when you're motivating someone with something, a reward or a punishment that's not inherently good in and of itself, but because it's a means to an end. So, for instance, you might not like money just because it's money. Like, oh, I just love the paper. It smells so good and the artwork on it is so nice. I could just stare at it for hours. If you're intrinsically motivated to collect bills and coins, maybe. But for the most part, we like money because it's a means to an end. It's an extrinsic motivator. Eating delicious food is intrinsically motivating for me, at least. Spending time doing something fun, but I have to pay for it, is intrinsically motivating. So getting money is not intrinsically motivating. It's extrinsically motivating because it's just a means to an end to do something that I actually like. And this is big in education and in management studies where you can actually, when you give someone too much of an obviously extrinsic reward, it kind of takes away their motivation to do it in its own right. So they've done studies where they'll take employees or they'll take kids and teach them some new skill or have them do puzzles or something. And sometimes they'll reward these people and sometimes they won't. Like they'll give them money if they solve enough problems or do enough of the puzzle or learn the skill, or they'll not give them money and like they're just doing it for free. And it turns out some people will find ways to enjoy something or just enjoy something for its own sake. And they'll say they really like it and they'll do it. They'll solve the whole puzzle and they'll solve all the problems and they'll learn the new skill. But the second you come in and start saying, okay, here's some money, now they conceptualize it as, oh, I'm being paid to do this. So this is just a job. I'm going to stop as soon as the money stops. It's something to kind of keep in mind if you're ever in a managerial position or an education position, that you can actually kind of backfire if you try to motivate people in the wrong way. Now, what's confusing with gaming is that many aspects of playing a video game are intrinsically motivating. Like I'm just having fun, not be for the sake of something else. It's just fun by itself. It's intrinsically motivating. But a lot of games, like with trophy hunting, you would think maybe, okay, I'm not having fun killing 80 rabbits so that I can go get the trophy of whatever. But eventually, when I've completed all of the quests, that will feel intrinsically motivating because I'm a completionist and I like to feel like I've finished everything. So, finishing everything and feeling like you're completely done might be intrinsically motivating, but the things you have to do to get there are extrinsic motivators. I've killed my 80th rabbit, and so I get this trophy. That's an extrinsic motivator. Whereas once I've gotten all of the dumb trophies and my trophy box is complete, that's intrinsically motivated. So what's puzzling to me is not that these things are extrinsically motivating, but why would you want to do these? Like, why is it intrinsically motivating to finish all the trophies or to max out all your characters? I don't really get it. Let's see. Something else that can really get you going with games is a sense in which we're kind of biased to really think about incompleted tasks. There's this thing called the Zeigarnik effect, where we tend to really pay attention to and remember unfinished business. So the mere fact that we have things we still need to do, like we haven't completed the task, can be motivating and get us to keep going. And this really might be part of an explanation for why some people are completionists. For me, I like finishing my work, but only when it's actual work that I care about. Like, I don't like, for instance, I don't like to grade some papers and then come back a few days later and grade the rest. That would drive me crazy. But then again, when I'm playing a video game, uh, I don't feel any need to finish everything. I'm going to play the game and have my fun, and if I'm not having fun, I'm going to play a different game. So different people sort of have different personalities and react differently. And yeah, so some games are designed kind of explicitly to try and take advantage of this. So Stardew Valley on the top right here is very famous for that one more day kind of mentality. Each day, you have a limited day each day to do a limited amount of stuff, and you're trying to balance. You're a farmer and you're watering your plants and you're upgrading your house and you're meeting people in the town It's more fun than it sounds like, honestly. Stardew Valley and the games that it's based on, the Harvest Moon series, might sound really lame, but it's actually really fun. You should give it a chance if you haven't. But yeah, you have these short days that take maybe 10, 15 minutes, depending on which game we're talking about, and like depending on how much of a groove you're in. And you kind of feel like at the end of each day, you're like, okay, I ran out of stuff I can do today, but there's still like I didn't water all of the crops, and I still need to make sure I bring this person in town this gift because I'm almost done maxing out my relationship with them. You kind of have all these things you're trying to keep track of, so it makes you just want to play one more day. And that's how you can get people glued to these games for hours on end. So far, I've been talking about ways to motivate people in a way that's sort of perhaps conscious, perhaps not. There's certainly people who are not consciously aware of why they're doing the things they're doing. So I'm going to talk about a thing called classical and operant conditioning. So in psychology was first becoming an empirical science. Um, it was a bunch of scientists basically doing controlled experiments on rats in boxes. So you can rigorously record exactly what behaviors the organism exhibited and what happened as a result of those behaviors. And you can kind of mathematically quantify and count everything. It's very objective. And before they were doing this, psychology was kind of a branch of philosophy. It was a bunch of people sitting in their armchairs, smoking pipes and speculating. There was no data collection. And then during this era of, it's called behaviorism, early in psychology's days, as a science, people called themselves behaviorists because they study behavior. They don't study thoughts, they don't study feelings, because you can't observe thoughts, you can't count feelings, you can't measure stuff going on in the mind. You can only study behavior and what happens as a result of that behavior in the environment of the organism. And they discovered a lot of really important stuff that goes a long way in explaining why we do the things we do, especially if we're not consciously aware of those things. So let's look at, yeah. One thing is you heard of a Skinner box. This is named after a guy, B.F. Skinner. He was a very famous behaviorist psychologist, and he would create these Skinner boxes where you put a rat in a box and there's these different things rigged up, like different lights can show up under different conditions, or like there's like a speaker. So there's different stimuli that the organism can experience, and there's like a lever, and you can program the box to behave in certain systematic ways, and you record how the organism reacts. You have rewards that can come in. You get little food pellets that will slide down the shaft if the rat plays his cards right. This is called a Skinner box, and that's a very popular term in game design circles, is turning your game into a Skinner box. There's a very well established and old science around making the contingencies of reinforcement such that you get someone hooked. A reinforcer is something that makes a behavior more common and more likely to occur in the future, and a punisher is something that makes a behavior less likely in the future. So a reinforcer would be like points or getting an extra life or unlocking a new weapon. A punishment would be like you die and you have to start the level over. Or if you're a kid and you've done something bad, you get a spanking. That's a punisher. So that distinction talks about the different kinds of reinforcers and punishers, and we're just talking about behaviors and what happens as a result of those behaviors. But especially relevant is this idea that there are different schedules of reinforcement. So on the one hand, you have, and I have the rows here, a ratio schedule of reinforcement and an interval schedule of reinforcement. A ratio reinforcement means that you get a set amount of stuff, like as a result of your behaviors, whereas an interval means you get your reinforcer after a certain time period. So if you're a rat in a box and you want to reinforce the behavior of pressing a lever, then you might, For a ratio reinforcement, you might give them a food pellet as a reward each time they press the lever, or you might give them a set amount of two food pellets for every two lever presses. With interval reinforcement, it might be you press the lever, and then after 5 seconds, you will get one food pellet. And you could systematically manipulate the time delay that comes how far does the food or the reward come after the desirable behavior. These things can make a really big difference. On top of the difference between ratio and interval reinforcement, there's also fixed versus variable reinforcement. So fixed reinforcement means it's the same amount every time, like the same amount of food pellets for a ratio schedule, or it's the same amount of time of reinforcement after you do the desired behavior. There's a fixed amount of time. The time doesn't vary. And then there's variable reinforcement. So with variable reinforcement, you might push the lever and you get different amounts of food each time you press it. Or with an interval schedule of reinforcement, you might press the lever and you might get the food pellet in a few seconds, you might get it in a few minutes. You really vary the timing of it. So it turns out that one of the best ways to get someone hooked on something is to use a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. That's where some desirable action, like buying a booster pack or pulling the lever on a slot machine, whatever behavior you want the organism, the customer, the rat, whatever you want them to do, if once you've gotten the behavior established, make it to where you give them a reward, but the reward varies. Sometimes they'll get a little bit, sometimes they'll get nothing, sometimes they'll get a lot. This is the kind of thing you see at casinos. Like once you've gotten the behavior established of pulling the lever, you don't want to give someone the same reward each time they put a coin in and pull the lever. You want it to be variable because people will keep pulling and pulling and pulling to get these different amounts of either a reward or the complete absence of reward. Likewise, in video games and in mobile games, you want people to play your game and sometimes get rewarded, but not every time. You don't want someone to be consistently rewarded with the same amount of reinforcement every time they play your game. Once you've gotten them playing your game, you want them to sort of get different amounts of reinforcement. That seems to be what really gets people coming back, is that there's kind of a uncertainty to it. The uncertainty itself really hooks people in. I'm going to finish off talking about individual differences in motivation among gamers. Something you might have picked up on throughout this lecture is that motivation, there are some universals with motivation. Like all humans need to eat and drink, and all humans, virtually all humans, like to have fun. But it can really vary a lot from person to person of what exactly does this specific person really enjoy. And the same is true for gamers. You can't tell from me, I'm not exactly the same as every gamer. Like I'm not a completionist. I hate trophy hunting, but a lot of people do. So these differences between people really matter. One of the ways to study differences among people is to conduct something called a factor analysis. We're going to learn a little bit. So factor analysis was actually invented for the purpose of doing psychology a little better, but it is its own thing. And in factor analysis, I'm going to speak a little loosely here. What I'm about to describe might be a better description of principal components analysis. But for this context, the difference between factor analysis and principal components analysis is not really that important. What these different techniques do is you take a bunch of variables like y1, y2, y3. These are a bunch of different variables, attributes of people. And the technique of factor analysis boils these down into just a few larger, all-encompassing variables. So to flesh that out, let's say you've got a bunch of students from LSUA. And for each student, you've got their height, you've got their weight, you've got their shoulder width. That's a weird one, but everyone's got a shoulder width. And then you've got their GPA, you've got their ACT/SAT scores, you've got their reading level. You can probably tell just from glancing at these variables that some of these are related to each other, and some of these are there's sort of these they cluster together. Some of these are clustered and correlated with each other. So when you do a factor analysis, God, I gotta keep moving myself out of the way. Factor analysis will rigorously and mathematically, we don't want to just depend on our intuition. It will mathematically say, okay, height and weight and shoulder, these factors are all loading onto the same latent variable. Like physical size is this sort of thing you can't directly measure by itself, but you can indirectly measure it by measuring these other things that are related to the broader concept of physical size. And then your GPA, ACT scores, and reading level are all sort of intercorrelated, and they're the outcome of some general thing called intelligence, or you could call it intelligence. I think it's important to point out that these things are really more a measure of achievement rather than intelligence. You can have a high GPA, ACT score, and be really good at reading and be a complete dummy. And also, a lot of people might be bad at these things, even though they're really smart. Sometimes how good you do in these things is a result of your upbringing and your environment and what kind of resources and what your parents really prioritized bringing up. But not to go too deep into that. Basically, factor analysis, long story short, is a way of taking a bunch of variables and figuring out whether they boil down to a certain number of underlying categories. So there was a study done in 2006 by Yi. They did a factor analysis looking at a bunch of gamers. They collected a bunch of different data on gamers and did a factor analysis on the results and found that there were 3 factors that emerged. Their factors were called social, immersion, and achievement. What happens when you do a factor analysis, especially an exploratory factor analysis, is basically you have a bunch of variables and you want to know, do these boil down to a few simpler variables that you can't directly measure, but these variables that we can measure, do they boil down to some simpler variables? And if so, how many of these simpler variables are? At the end of this factor analysis, you'll have a number of latent variables or factors, and you'll know which observed and measured variables like height and weight. You'll know how these are related to the factors, but it won't just give you a name because it's just math. It's just data. You have to kind of go and see like, oh, this thing's related to this thing and this thing's related to this thing. So these things clustering over here have more to do with social stuff. And these things clustered over here have more to do with immersion stuff. And these things over here have more to do with achievement stuff. So what I thought was neat was Yi in 2006 discovered that the 3 sort of dimensions of being a gamer actually map onto the more theoretical based self-determination theory that we saw earlier. So self-determination theory proposed that one of the things that drives us to do things in life is seeking out a sense of relatedness. Well, it turns out when you go and study gamers and try and figure out what are the factors that really differentiate gamers from one another, it turns out that sort of a sense of wanting to socialize or not socialize is one of the major factors. It also turns out that competence really is a major factor when you poll gamers. A lot of them, a way to kind of divvy up gamers, one of the main factors that differentiates one gamer from another is their motivation to be high achieving in a game. So I guess I'm probably not motivated by achievement too much. I'm really motivated because I just like having fun. If I'm not having fun, I stop. Like I played Dark Souls for one night and I was done. Like I have all the respect in the world for Dark Souls. I think artistically it's a very interesting game, but I just don't have fun. And I'm not going after bragging rights to be like, oh yeah, I beat Dark Souls. I'm such a badass. So I'm a low achievement motivated gamer. And then, what's neat is that the factor analysis said that immersion, so kind of getting immersed in the game and feeling like you're invested in this new world and you're experiencing this different walk of life compared to your normal life. It turns out that when you poll gamers, that's one of the things that really differentiates one gamer from another. That's something that self-determination theory didn't really predict. Self-determination theory would have said that autonomy was one of the major things that motivates gamers. And since self-determination theory is a general psychological framework to try and explain all human activity, it might be that autonomy just doesn't play as much of a role, although I think it does. And I think you could really make the argument that that is one of the reasons that games are fun for people. It just turns out that empirically, when you look at the data, for gaming at least, autonomy doesn't appear to be one of the main motivators, although Yi might not have actually asked that many questions about autonomy. That's one of the drawbacks of factor analysis is you have to have an exhaustive list. If you want to rule out the idea that there are these main factors and not these other factors within some group or activity, you have to actually ask questions about all the different things that might be factors. And I don't know if Yi actually asked about, like, did they ask participants, like, I play games because I like feeling like there are no rules? If there's an item like that on their survey, then and like that item didn't really like systematically load or cluster onto other similar items, then you could probably rule out the idea that seeking autonomy is a major motivator for playing games. That could be a neat deep dive to go down. Do I have any more slides? No, I'm out of slides. All right. Got into our first real science heavy lecture today, and I hope you all enjoyed it. As of this recording, we have not gone to the arcade yet. Hopefully, I see you all there on Wednesday. But until then, you have a good one.